I'm honored to be here with you all. I have great respect for Michael and for this network, and I meet people around the country who are part of the network, and I'm so glad I can be here with you all today. The topic I was invited to reflect on under the general heading of creating a caring society was spiritual visions for social healing. And what I'd like to do before getting into spiritual visions for social healing, I'd like to turn it upside down. And I'd like to talk for a couple of minutes about religious visions for social damage. Or we might want to call it religious visions for social suicide. Because I think we would all agree, people in this room, that the problems that we face in this world demand people of faith be involved to address them. But we also would have to acknowledge that it's people of faith who are exacerbating an awful lot of problems in the world. Unintentionally, we hope, but we're as often part of the problem as we are a part of the solution. I don't remember exactly the year, but I think it was in the 90s. It was 94, 98, somewhere in that range, when a group of respected scientists that included Carl Sagan and E.O. Wilson and others, when they started facing the accumulating data of environmental destruction, especially climate change, they called a meeting where a number of religious leaders were invited to meet with them. I don't know, some folks in this room may have been there. I wasn't there, but a friend of mine was. And the meeting began something like this, with these reputable scientists saying, listen, we in the scientific community accumulate data that tells us we are in deep, deep trouble. But our forte is not motivating people to change their values and lifestyle. That's supposed to be your specialty, you religious leaders, they said. So what we're saying is the future of the human race depends on us getting the verses out from between faith and science. The future of the human race requires now that we leaders in science reach out to you people of faith and say, we can bring the data to the table, but you have to bring the motivation to the table and a vision that would help people change their values. And that, to me, is what this network of spiritual progressives has been so vital in articulating, is this kind of a vision for social change. But if we don't face, especially for those of us in the religious community, our culpability in the creation of the problems that we share, I don't think we'll be able to repent deeply enough and design an alternative vision that is profound and strong enough. So I would just like to tell you at the core of this what I see our job as spiritual people as being. See, religious communities, among the many contributions they make, they infuse narratives into communities. They help communities be formed by narratives. By narratives, I mean big stories. If we were in a philosophical setting, we could debate whether the word meta-narratives would be an appropriate term or not. It's a problematic word, but let's just say big stories that frame our lives. I call them framing stories. And sadly, I think there are some framing stories that are terribly destructive that we now have to evolve and develop and grow and mature beyond. One of them is the us versus them narrative. And this narrative builds on the idea that to have a strong identity, you have to be against people of other identities. You could call this a counter-dependent identity. Now, a lot of us grew up with that kind of identity. To be a Christian is to be out to convert everybody else to your faith. Or to be a Jew is to remember how Christians have mistreated you and understand us and them in a contrary relationship. So our history and our theology conspire to give us the idea that to have a strong religious identity sets you at odds with people of other strong religious identities. And the time-tested solution to this that is deeply embedded in American culture is to say the only way around this is to weaken people's religious identities. And in some ways, that's the dream of secularism. If we could just nominalize people's religious commitments, reduce their religious identity, then we'd all get along. Guess what we found out? It doesn't work. You remove that kind of religious identity and other identities emerge, whether they're left, right, political identities, whether they're tribal and ethnic identities, whether they're regional or economic or ideological identities. But in the absence of one kind of counter-dependent identity, others emerge. And so what I think we who are spiritual progressives have a special obligation to do now is to help form strong religious identities that provide an alternative to the us versus them religious identity that's so inherent in many of our religious communities, especially mine, coming from a conservative Protestant background. If I could define that us versus them narrative, where it leads to an identity of I am right, therefore I am. And I am right is an alternative to I think. But it's this kind of a narrative is so deeply embedded in our religious traditions. Second narrative is an us versus nature narrative. And this is the narrative that, I used to be an English teacher before becoming a pastor. And back in elementary school, when we started learning about literature, we learned about the man versus nature theme in literature. Now we wouldn't say man, but that narrative is still very much alive and well. Have you ever noticed we even play into it on all of those Discovery Channel nature show, Survivor Man, it's this, in fact, there's a show called Man versus Nature, right? And we're still intrigued by sharks and any animals with fangs and claws because they help us keep that ancient narrative alive. Well, one of the transitions that we're having to come to terms with is that we won the battle of man versus nature, of humanity versus nature. And now the danger is that we're going to win, not that we're going to lose, because by winning we have the worst kind of loss of all. But this humanity versus nature, humanity versus creation narrative is so deeply embedded in a lot of our religious communities. No doubt it solved problems 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. But now it's creating problems, and we have to find a way to transcend that narrative. A third narrative that is especially deeply rooted in our monotheistic faiths. And this might surprise you that I'd say it this way, but I think if you give me a chance, I think you'll see what I mean. It's the God versus us narrative. It's the narrative that at a profound level sees God as our enemy. And in a sense, it becomes a description of how this religion is going to save us from God. Now, how many of us feel like, yeah, you know what, I grew up with that. The purpose of my religion was to save me from an angry, scary God who, whether because of holiness or whatever other reason, inherently was in opposition to my existence. This is deeply rooted in American history because probably a lot of you, in a completely non-religious context, but in American literature, would have read Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And this is a mainstay of revivalist preaching, and it's deeply embedded in Christian faith, especially in the Western tradition of Christian faith. Now, I'm going to be a little bit uncharitable here, but I'll try to say it with a smile, all right? But when you present God as enemy and religion as what saves you from a hostile God, religion becomes a kind of mafia in a protection racket. You know how protection rackets work. You live in a poor neighborhood and somebody comes along and says, look, you can't trust the police and you can't trust those gangs and all those crooks. For a mere $500 a month, I will protect you from all of those bad people. And you say, well, I'm sorry, I don't have it. Well, then you find out, well, if you don't pay me the $500 a month, you need to be protected from me. You understand? And that's what you call a protection racket. And religion, when it fosters the narrative of God as enemy, religion becomes a forgiveness racket, an atonement racket. And it needs to keep the narrative of the enemy God alive in order to have a product that you desperately need. Now, I hate to say it that uncharitably, but if the first narrative, the us versus them narrative, says I'm right, therefore I am, then the second narrative says I consume, therefore I am, or I exploit, therefore I am, or I transcend nature, therefore I am. I'm different, therefore I am. And this third narrative says I'm an insider, therefore I am. I've figured out a way to get on God's good side, to become one of the holy few, the saved, the favored, the blessed. And because I'm in, I exist and I can feel safe.